This conference will now be recorded.
In this section, we are going to discuss about parameter levels. So when you consider a specific web application, there can be different parameters available throughout your application. Some parameter like username, which can appear maybe in multiple segments of your application, like a specific login page, maybe a registration page, or maybe a comments page. So it can be found in various segments of your URL. So based on that, we can classify the parameters or define the parameters as follows. One is your global parameters or URL parameters or flow parameters. So parameters which can appear in multiple URLs of an application can be referred as your global URLs. So these type of parameters are defined as global because its name and the attributes can be configured once and ASM will enforce it in the same way wherever it occurs. Or some parameters can only be relevant to a specific URL. Maybe only your login page has the username. So which means that only slash when you access in your web application, let's say abc.com slash login.php. So only this specific URL has your username parameter. So this parameter will be applicable only at the URL level. That parameter is relevant to that URL. So those type of parameters we call that as a URL parameter. And then at the last you have flow parameters, in where you define a context of a flow which is important to enforce, whether a parameter is in a get request or a post request. So how that flow actually happens. So from one part of your application, you go to the initial index page, and then maybe from there you enter some details which initiates a post request to your target URL. So these flow parameters can be having a specific entry point defined. Like let's say once you click on your application, you click register.php, and from here you are using HTTP protocol. You generate a specific post using post method. You try to navigate to cell.php. So your flow is important in this kind of parameter. So defining a parameter in the context of a flow is what defines your flow parameters. So on a standard level, these are your parameter classifications. So when it comes to understanding the parameter logic, or how these are implemented or processed in your security policy, the flow is always from most specific to least specific. Let's try to understand the logic of parameters. So let's assume you got a request for test.php, and in here you have a referrer, which is mysite.com page1.html. This is the request which you initiated from the client machine. So first, the most specific will be checked, which is your flow parameter. So with specific to this request, is there any flow parameter defined? Like defining the entry point or HTTP, you have entry point, then using HTTP protocol, you initiated a GET request going to, let's say, test.php in consideration to this specific request. And in this specific page, we have the ID parameter defined. Do you have anything in your like this defined in your security policy? If it is no, if it is yes. Okay, if it is yes, then in your security policy, we'll check the parameter value. The parameter value 123, 123, which is mentioned in your request, is this allowed? Or if let's say there is no flow parameter defined, then it will check whether a URL parameter is defined. Maybe on test.php, do we have the ID parameter? And if it is defined, then it will check, okay, for this parameter, do we have this value which is allowed? Or if it is not present, let's say you have not defined URL parameter as well, then it will check whether any global parameter is defined. If it is defined again, yes, it will check whether that is allowed or not. If it is allowed, then it will pass on the request to the web server. Otherwise, it is blocked there itself without even passing to the web server. Again, if it is not defined, then parameter value, it will check 123. Is this disallowed? Unless there is any wildcard which exists. So this is the exact traffic flow in terms of parameters. So it always goes from most specific to the least specific. So flow parameter being the most specific and global parameter being the less specific. And when it comes to parameter, you can also consider specific options wherein you can define the input. You can have the parameter value, the input as ignore value, or you can have a user input value. So what value type, like in our previous sessions, we have discussed for static parameter, we can have a static content, or for dynamic, we can have a dynamic content input defined. And then if there are some certain parameters which are having or which are containing crucial information with respect to your application, you can also define those parameters as your sensitive parameters. This feature is used to protect sensitive user information data, such as like passwords or credit card informations, in a validated request. So with this, we complete this specific section.